Hello, I'm Avery Brooks. You're about to experience the very first episode from the Star Trek Deep Space Nine Chronicles entitled Emissary. Have you ever noticed how much time and effort it took to launch this series? Well, let me throw out a few interesting facts. For the 2-hour premiere, 250 special effects shots had to be created, twice the number for an average Star Trek feature film. It cost over $200,000 to build the highly detailed space station model. 3 enormous sound stages on the Paramount lot were needed to film the pilot. And in the end, it took almost 200 people over 5 months to complete just 85 minutes of film.
Is that it?
But all that hard work paid off. When this episode debuted in January 1993, it became the highest-rated premiere in syndication history. So sit back and enjoy the very beginning of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Emissary.
I'm Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles. Welcome to Part 2 of Emissary, the conclusion to the 2-hour movie that launched the series back in 1993. When the producers were coming up with the idea for this new show, a lot of Western comparisons were made. The DS9 station was called the Fort Laramie of outer space, and similar in setting to Dodge City. Benjamin Sisko was likened to television's The Rifleman because he was a single father playing a sheriff in a remote town-like setting. Even Dr. Bashir practiced frontier medicine. But the Western references go way back to the very beginning of Star Trek in the 1960s. At that time, Western dramas were very popular. So, series creator Gene Roddenberry thought he might fool the NBC executives into buying the show by pitching it as a wagon train to the stars. Is there any wonder why they call it the Final Frontier? So get ready, because Sisko and the gang are getting ready to circle the wagons in the conclusion of Emissary.
Welcome to Part 2 in the first ever 3-part installment of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. If you thought the French Revolution was a big deal, wait until you see what's about to unfold in outer space. The fate of the crew of Deep Space Nine and a whole section of the galaxy is up for grabs.
We gotta leave.
And this episode is extra special because it features a slew of famous guest stars. Frank Langella, whom you might remember from the films Dracula and Dave. Richard Beymer, who starred in West Side Story. Philip Angler, Broadway's original Elephant Man. And last but not least, the Academy Award-winning actress from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Louise Fletcher. This is one of her many guest appearances as Betty Quinn, a spiritual leader with mysterious motives. I'm Sir Rock Lofton. We hope you enjoyed this star-studded episode from the Deep Space Nine Chronicles, entitled The Circle.
You're about to see an episode from the Deep Space Nine Chronicles that made the Final Frontier history books. That's because it's the first 3-part episode in the Star Trek legacy. And Part 1 has plenty of high drama, from Kira risking life and limb to rescue a forgotten national hero, to a very strong threat of civil war looming throughout the station and the planet below.
What you did today, Major, was declare war on Cardassia.
Plus, you'll meet a very recognizable guest star whose name was intentionally left out of the credits, Frank Langella, famous for such films as Dracula, Junior, and Dave, who plays Minister Jarro, a mysterious political leader who could undermine the entire peace process in the quadrant.
You can't expect a politician to give up an opportunity like this.
Rumor has it that Mr. Langella took the job at the behest of his children, who are big fans of the show. I'm Armin Shimmerman. We hope you enjoy Star Trek Deep Space Nine's The Homecoming.
Welcome to the Deep Space Nine Chronicles. I'm Alexander Siddig. When you watch this next episode, you might think you're seeing double. Don't worry. It's because the crew is thrown into an alternate universe where they meet their strange alter egos. It's also an episode that fast became a cult classic among viewers. Why? Well, for one, the storyline is derived from an original Star Trek episode entitled Mirror Mirror. In that one, Captain Kirk and company were also thrown into an alternate universe. Now, some 100 years later in the Trek chronology, the story picks up where Kirk left off. This also happens to be one of the most challenging productions ever shot on the Deep Space Nine series because the promenade and station sets had to be changed dramatically. Big spotlights and fences were included to create the look of a prison yard. Special smoke machines were brought in, steam blew up from the floor vents, the whole place looked like a futuristic Hades. But as you'll see, it all paid off to great effect in this episode. Big crossover.
There are a lot of people who wonder why Deep Space Nine brought on the Defiant warship. Some think it was to make DS9 more like the next generation. Some think it was to give Sisko a ship of his own. Well, the truth, however, was much more simple. The sets of the runabout were always too small to shoot large scenes with many crew members. Guest starring in this episode is Jonathan Frakes, who played Riker on The Next Generation. When Defiant first aired, Star Trek Generations had just been released, so in order to keep the continuity of the Star Trek universe intact, the creators felt obliged to mention the destruction of the Enterprise in this episode. Now, also starring in this episode is Tricia O'Neill, who has the honor of playing the first female captain of the Enterprise in an episode from The Next Generation called Yesterday's Enterprise. I'm Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles.
To boldly go where no one has gone before can also mean to boldly go where some have been, only it may be harder to get there. Retracing the footsteps of an historical journey is what Sisko takes on in this episode, Explorers. Using an ancient space sailboat designed by Industrial Light and Magic and inspired by the writings of Jules Verne, Sisko and Jake try to prove that a trip could have been made centuries before. Also in this episode, there's the first mention of a bathroom in Star Trek history. We always wondered about that. Listen closely when O'Brien and Bashir have a few too many and sing an old English banty called Jerusalem.
We have built.
Colomini selected this song himself, but it wasn't their first choice. They unsuccessfully tried to get the rights to Louie Louie, Rocket Man, and Major Tom. I'm Sirach Lofton for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles.
After watching this episode, you'll know why the Klingons are the villains everyone loves to hate. This is the show that may be noted for bringing Worf on board Deep Space Nine as part of the crew. Thankfully, it resulted in a phenomenal response from the fans. You'll also see some incredible special effects with some of the highest production value on television today. Take a close look at those shots of the Klingon fleet hanging in space. Impressive. But a lot of those ships should be hanging from Christmas trees since they're actually Star Trek ornaments used as background layers. Still, others are Star Trek toys redesigned for this episode. Go figure. This episode is called The Way of the Warrior, the show that dared to be different. I'm Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles. Bringing the Klingons to Deep Space Nine surprised everybody, even the writers. The Adversary, which ended Season 3, was a cliffhanger meant to be continued in a two-parter. But with Worf joining the crew, the emphasis had to be shifted, and the breakdown of the Klingon peace treaty opened the door to one of the most exciting conflicts ever imagined. It was this episode that marked the first time in the history of Star Trek that the Klingons and the Federation were formally at war. Although the Klingons have been called the best alien race ever created on Star Trek, you may not know that they were featured in only a handful of episodes from the original series. Yet, they left an indelible mark that was aggressively explored on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Loaded with some of the most fabulous special effects ever created for the series, this episode called The Way of the Warrior Part 2 set the tone for the most exciting season yet. I'm Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles.
Imagine your ultimate fantasy at your very fingertips. Well, on Deep Space Nine, our unique holosuites can make that possible. With three-dimensional holographic technology and transporter beams, we not only see pure fantasy, but can touch it as well. And scientists at the University of Illinois want to make it a reality. They've created a virtual reality simulator called the Cave that tricks the mind into a myriad of alternate realities. Who knows? Before long, we could all have holosuites in our own living rooms. On this episode, Our Man Bashir, my character gets trapped with Garak in a holosuite fantasy with all the trappings of a great James Bond movie. In fact, when this episode originally aired, it coincided with the release of GoldenEye. Many elaborate new sets were built for this episode, creations which 007 himself would have felt at home in. I'm Alexander Siddig for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles.
This episode features Miles O'Brien, who made his first appearance in the 2-hour premiere of Star Trek The Next Generation along with yours truly. It was such a small role that he only had a title, no name. But over time, that would change. In fact, it was the fans, bless their hearts, that begged the show to give him a full name. When he came aboard Deep Space Nine, he soon became the character the writers loved to torture. From Tribunal in the 2nd season to this episode, Hard Time, O'Brien has met his share of personal anguish. The idea for Hard Time had been around since the 1st season, and each time the premise was suggested, it got rejected. But, thanks to the persistence of the writers, the idea of a character being punished for a crime he didn't commit with implanted memories of incarceration was finally presented in the 4th season. And after seeing this episode, you'll be glad it was. This is Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles. Welcome to that old tricky mirror universe again, where anything is possible and anything could go wrong. I'm Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles. In this episode, Shattered Mirror, the alter ego of Sisko's deceased wife comes back for Jake, and a mirror universe defiant must save the day. If only Sisko can show them how to use it. There's a strange tradition in these alternate universe stories, and if you're Ferengi, it's not very pleasant. It began in Crossover when dear old Quark met an untimely demise and continued in Through the Looking Glass when Rom was killed. That left only one Ferengi alive, and Good Money says Nog's days are few and far between. This is also an episode featuring Felicia M. Bell, who makes her 3rd appearance as Jennifer Sisko, despite the fact that her character was killed off in the series premiere. How's that for resilience? We hope you enjoy Shattered Mirror. This is a weapon of war used by those ruthless warriors, the Jem'Hadar. I'm Michael Dorn for the Deep Space Nine Chronicles. This episode has our crew working hand in hand with the enemy they most fear. And if you're curious, the name Jem'Hadar was not made up out of thin air. Jem'Hadar is a rank in the Indian National Army equivalent to that of lieutenant. Also in this episode, you'll see a very familiar actor. The lead Jem'Hadar soldier is being played by Clarence Williams III, who played Link of the Mod Squad. You also may have seen another character in this episode very familiar to DS9. Jeffrey Combs, who played Herbie West in the feature film Reanimator, plays the evil Vorta, and played Brunt, the Ferengi Commerce Authority agent, in several episodes. I guess that means versatility is an alien strong point. Now, look for lots of new weapons like this, created especially for this action-packed episode To the Death, directed by LeVar Burton.